Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down some of my oldest tournament footage. In fact, it is my first tournament's footage. I am going to be on the left side in the jeans and the loner jacket, but the reason I am going over this isn't because I want to break down my own fencing or talk about where I've improved. I think I've already done that before and it's pretty obvious when you watch it. But specifically, I want to talk about how HEMA has changed since then. In my opinion, HEMA has gotten actually a lot better, even after COVID wiped out a whole lot of people and a whole lot of tournaments. But you have to really be able to go back and look at the footage yourself in order to really understand what was different about HEMA back then and how it has changed until now. So for our first exchange, we have a couple interesting things to point out. The first is the fact that I am still utilizing my extremely linear Olympic fencing footwork. Again, this is my first tournament, and I had only really been training HEMA for about 5-6 months, so I was still breaking some of those old habits. And what you see in this particular exchange is I go for a thrust against my opponent, and my opponent has a very interesting reaction. They simply wind up their blade in order to try to zone me out, and it doesn't quite work out for them. As you can see, I get pretty darn close to landing that thrust on my opponent's head, at which point, after they wind, they realize I'm trying to retreat. They throw all caution to the wind, throw out their left hand to try to sweep my guard and my sword off to the side, which gets them hit on the hand, looks like pretty hard, and then they just wallop me with a one-handed cut to the chest. Now, the other thing to point out here is the winding. Fencing tournaments in the pre-COVID era were, in a lot of times in America, based off of long point. And long point had a fun little rule called the control point. I've mentioned it before in other videos, but the basics are that if you manage to land a cut or a thrust, though usually a thrust, against your opponent while simultaneously locking out their blade from all potential harm in the bind, you would get 4 points, which is a ton of points, especially considering that most of the time you wouldn't get more than 5 or 6 exchanges. Meaning that most of the time, one good control point could completely make up for 2 or even 3 bad exchanges you had prior. And so a lot of people were really focused on these winding style motions, particularly because if you manage to get one and then you manage to hit somebody, specifically in a grapple, like with what my opponent is going for, you could get control points and get more than enough to make up for any other kind of failure you had, including getting hit on the hand on the way in. So one of the things that you can really point out here is that back in the day, people didn't really stop exchanges at what would normally be stopped on an exchange today, like hand shots during a grapple. The reason for that isn't just because they would throw out the hand shots, though they would sometimes do that. It's also because they wanted to let things play out so they could then review it in their mind and give up points accordingly, because a lot of times the afterblow timing of these tournaments was really wide. So the combination of all these things coming together, the wide afterblow tempo, the fact that they would sometimes ignore hand shots and let exchanges play out, and the fact that you could get control points either by thrusting and winding someone out, or by grappling them and hitting them with your sword, meant that that was pretty much all anyone ever went for, and it was all anyone pretty much ever trained for. Next up, we have another exchange that's pretty indicative of another quirk that happened a lot during pre-COVID era HEMA fencing, and that is the hang and parry drill. I guess is really the only word that I have for it. And the basic idea plays off of what I was saying before about the winding focus. So one of the things that, as you probably know, happens every time you wind from a plow into an ox position is that you end up in that ox position and you've either landed your thrust, wound out your opponent's blade, or you're just kind of standing there. And what happens is that when you're standing in that ox position and your opponent throws a cut, well, the best defense that you can put up against that is a hanging parry. The hanging parry drapes down over your opening, it takes the cut, and then, of course, your follow-up is to come around with a follow-up cut. Pretty basic example. Except the problem was that people were so well trained on this winding, hanging parry, and then counter cut drill, is that that's what would happen over and over again. Someone would throw a hanging parry, they'd block, they'd throw a counter cut, and then the other person who was just trying to do a wind and then a hanging parry themselves would instead throw that same follow-up counter cut, and the pattern would just repeat until someone did it fast enough or did it to a different target that they managed to land. In this particular instance, I do manage to land one to the offside of the arm or top of the shoulder or something like that after my opponent hits me. But what's really important here is that we were both doing this drill just back and forth until someone decided to break the pattern. And most importantly, the second someone decided to break the pattern, we both just hit each other. So this was really common back in the day because, again, most people were training for that long point tournament rule set, and as a result, they were absolutely obsessed with these binding and winding drills, of which the hanging parry was just a natural conclusion. Next up in our exchanges, we have a big thrust on my part, one that I land pretty successfully, and one that my opponent does not successfully zone out with their own attempted wind. But there's another important detail to pay attention to here, and that is the fact that the control point, as I previously defined it, required a complete lockout in the bind. And what that means is that a lot of people, whether they meant to do so intentionally or not, would start winding their way out of any sort of situation where they got stabbed, if not only to try to counter stab them and get some points back, but specifically to make sure that it was obvious to the judges that they did not get locked out themselves. You have to imagine a situation where the difference between getting 4 points against you and 2 points against you comes down to not whether or not you could have adequately parried a thrust, but whether or not at the point where you were thrusted, you were able to get your sword out of a difficult bind and then reassert some sort of threat, even if you didn't end up making it. Of course, with the long afterblow tempos, there was often more than enough time for many people to get out of a complete lockout and then do something as a follow-up. People at the time were completely obsessed with this control point style judging, and they saw it as the ideal scenario in which you were demonstrating proper German fencing. Because, of course, as you know from reading the Germanic treatises, binding and winding is definitely the focus of pretty much all of them. So the idea here was by giving the maximum number of points to someone who demonstrated the ideal scenario of Germanic fencing, they were doing exactly what HEMA was meant to do, represent old-style fencing through the gamification of it through sport. And the irony is that this situation ended up with people coming up with some seriously gamey counter-offensives. As you can see here, the idea of my opponent here was not, oh no, I've been stabbed, they got a control point, it's time for me to quit and hang up my sword. It was, if I can weave my sword out of this position and almost seem like I could maybe land a thrust of my own, then they're not going to give them the control point and I'm going to save 2 points. And suddenly, an idea that was supposed to make people fence more historically has resulted in the exact opposite. Now, this next clip comes with a bit of a pop quiz. What style of fencing do you think my opponent in the green shirt learned? Your time is up. It's pretty obviously Fiore. And one of the things to point out about this is that back in the day, people were absolutely obsessed with getting these picture-perfect representations of their master's fencing. You see my opponent go into, I think it's a posta di donna with the sword just all the way down the back in just the most meaninglessly useless position I've ever seen. And more importantly, when they're down there in their boar's tooth, it's not just down low, man, that thing is practically touching the floor about a foot to their left. It is almost silly to look at now, but what you have to understand is that back in the day, almost nobody did Fiore. And the reason nobody did Fiore was because everyone who did Fiore was, again, obsessed with replicating these pictures, but B, they didn't go to tournaments. And the reason they didn't go to tournaments was because every time they tried to replicate one of their pictures, they realized very quickly that the positions they were putting themselves in were just fundamentally useless positions to be in. A posta di donna is just patently awful. It doesn't work. It's a silly place to be. And what people had to yet to realize at this point was that the pictures in a lot of cases were artistic expression or exaggeration or just flat out not drawn by the person who wrote the manual. A lot of times, especially in some of the earlier texts, the pictures are god awful. So awful that they can actually mislead you from making a correct interpretation of a play. As a result, a lot of people, though, back in the day, were doing some very, very silly looking things, taking snapshots of their footage and basically going off and saying, well, I did what HEMA's really about. I made myself look like the picture, and therefore I had a more historical interpretation. Therefore, I had a more historical style of fencing. And therefore, it doesn't matter that I lost almost every single exchange because I couldn't, even get my point on target before it managed to come off of my spine. So the point here isn't just the fact that actually, my opponent did actually stab me in the chest pretty effectively, but the real important thing here is that our understanding of HEMA interpretations has really grown since this time. And nowadays, people understand that judging an interpretation based on how it looks based on the picture is a really, really bad way to go about it. The pictures just aren't good. A lot of times you can just completely ignore the picture, even when they're very nice looking, because the pictures just don't correlate very well to the actual play you're trying to learn. But until people learned that, they were striking a pose in the middle of bouts, and they were getting hit. So if you've ever wondered what it was like to do HEMA back in the day, there was a lot more posing, and there was a lot more people who were using their picture-perfect poses as a coping mechanism for the fact that they kept losing. All right, that's going to be it for today. It's going to be a little bit of a short one, but I'm going to let the footage play out a little bit for the rest of my fight with the Fiorist, not because it's good footage, but because you get to have an unimpeded view of a Jake Norwood with no gray hair and Tim Kaufman's man bun. And I think that's kind of funny. But what's really important to take away from this is that HEMA has undoubtedly improved. The number of people fencing has gone up quite a bit. The number of tournaments has gone up quite a bit. The average attendance of these tournaments that there are more of has gone up quite a bit. And in my opinion, the level of technical skill it takes to get to the top of one of these tournaments has gone up quite a bit. But if you're the kind of person who really cares about historical accuracy, and I'm not saying I'm not one of those people, I would also like to use this opportunity to display to you some footage that probably looked extremely ahistorical to you, and most importantly, was not winning the tournaments. So, if you're the kind of person who thinks that HEMA was better back in the day, well, you've got some explaining to do. But if you're the kind of person who thinks that HEMA has been moving away from historical accuracy, well, hopefully this can serve as a pretty nice explanation as to why that's not the case. In my opinion, and as I think I've demonstrated using this footage, people used to get away with doing just as much ahistorical stuff to win tournaments as they used to, given that I was doing pretty well in this tournament, and I certainly didn't deserve to. And more importantly, that the kind of people who were more historically minded at the time hadn't yet started winning tournaments, which they now do. Nowadays, the people who win tournaments not only produce things that actually do look like the pictures sometimes, but also are just more efficacious and more effective, which means that at the end of the day, if you want to be a more historical fencer, you should actually try applying the tactics and strategy that exists in these books and in these texts, rather than just trying to replicate them as a kind of, Renaissance fair style dress up. So with that, hopefully you're not too angry at me, but if you are, feel free, write me a paragraph down in the comments. I love them every time. And I will see you next week.